Hey, good morning, Uday and Bhargav. Thanks for catching up on an impromptu. Just wanted to get a quick rundown on what's going on through the various regions we cover. Not all the issues, of course, but just a couple of the major ones that pop to mind. Uday, for example, the drug bust in Gujarat. Over to you.
Hi, Paul. Yeah, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the drug bust that happened in Gujarat in mid-September. Indian authorities about over 3,000 kg of heroin at the port of Mandura in Gujarat. This heroin originated in Afghanistan and it went to Iran before it was shipped to India. Now, there's a few interesting implications of this, or things that we can see from this incident. First is that despite Taliban assurances that they would not let the country become a hub for drug smuggling or, base for terror groups to operate, you see that heroin smuggling is still going because the value of opiate exports from Afghanistan are estimated to be around 1.5 to 3.5 billion US dollars. And now there's also concerns that, the drug trade will increase because of the production of methamphetamines in Afghanistan. So it is possible that during the Taliban rule of Afghanistan, India becomes increasingly a transshipment point or a final destination for drugs, and these drugs will be supplied across the world. Another thing that's interesting from this incident is the seizure happened at the Mundra port in Gujarat, which is operated by the Adani Group. Now, this is a very secure site, and the fact that 3,000 kilos of heroin was sitting on the port may imply some facilitation by some of the employees over there, because it's a massive lapse in port security. And the fact is that it is a secure state site.
Look, that's interesting, Uday. I'll just cut in there. I mean, there's not a port in the world that's immune from organised crime, but it seems like there's an alignment that enables it to be facilitated down that route. And Taliban and perhaps some of the standards in Adani are enabling, certainly, I mean, it's now obvious that a new shipment route has been exposed, but how easily that route can be closed down is another thing entirely, I guess.
Yeah, thanks for your insight, Paul. I think I'm going to shift this over to Bhargav now, who could discuss Europe and the African region.
Thank you there. Before moving to Europe and Africa, I would like to pitch in about the role of Iran as an intermediary in the drug trade. I mean, it's quite conspicuous that Iran, being a Shia country, seems to be playing safe with a Sunni extremist militia like Taliban, which have a record of targeting Shia diaspora within Afghanistan. Do you have anything to say about that? I mean, it's quite interesting that Chabahar port specifically has been used for such a big overhaul. Let's say 3,000 kilos, was it?
Yes, Bhargav, it was 3,000 kilos. And that's an interesting nexus that you pull up, especially with regards to the religious dynamic. But it kind of shows, I think, the importance of the financial trade between the two countries across their borders, some of it which includes drugs. And Iranian ports are also very well secured. So the fact is that the drugs crossed the Afghan-Iran border, they went somewhere in the country, and then they went to the port. So there, as Paul, you mentioned, there definitely is some facilitation or some dynamics between people on both sides of the equation here.
It might even also indicate that a lot of people hide behind religion, that commerce and personal interests are a whole lot more important. So religion can become a habit, a cultural habit of acceptable behaviours, but behind those acceptable behaviours, behind that facade, there's often totally different behaviours driven by the normal human qualities of greed and selfishness. Anyway, back to Europe and Africa, Bhargav.
Certainly, Paul. Paul, in Europe, German elections have recently concluded, and the incumbent CDU bloc, or let's say Union bloc, led by Christian Democratic Union, seems to have lost nearly 50 seats compared to the last elections. They have dropped down to 196 seats. And it seems at the moment that the current Vice Chancellor, Olaf Scholz of Social Democratic Party, seems to be gaining an upper hand and could possibly the next Chancellor once the current Chancellor, that is Angela Merkel, steps down. We can see this in different light, actually. The Social Democrats in general are pro-European Union. And one positive outcome is that the far right-wing AFD have actually lost 11 seats. They were anyway minuscule minority in terms of the political spectrum. However, the entire political spectrum seems to be going more towards the center left rather than center right or far right. I guess that's a positive development. What do you think, Paul?
I'm not sure, mate. I think we've got to watch and sit back and just see how the coalition discussions go. I mean, they're talking about hoping to form a government by December, but the reality is I think it's going to take a little bit longer. And of course, there are implications to not only the European Union, but the wider landscape of how other countries beyond Europe interact with Germany. So I can't basically predict where this is going. I think that movement is your political analysis on where it's shifting is correct. There's no doubt about that. But where it ends up in terms of which coalitions help form a strong government, I'm not sure.
Well, at the same time, across the channel in UK, there seems to be continued protests by the environmentalists, and the country is also facing some of the other issues related to Brexit and shortage of drivers. Of course, it may sound comical that truck drivers are in short supply, but that's what you get when you pull out of a union like European Union, which supplies them labor as well as commodities. Paul, can we move on to Africa from there?
Oh, look, I think it's just interesting to observe the UK. I think it's the beginning of a world of hurt, the reality of when you pull out of the European Union for all the reasons that the Brits love to quote. But they've got issues with their island protectorates with big French populations and shared fishing areas. Now the shortage of fuel, shortage of supplies to supermarkets. I think this is the beginning of a whole heap of return to the realities of when you don't have cheap labour, and the Brits aren't renowned, since they stopped their coal miners being miners, they're not renowned for wanting to do those laborious tasks. And so I think this is only the initial indicator of where that's all going to head. And I noticed on the sporting front, the Brits don't want to have to do a quarantine in Australia for the Ashes series, and their families certainly shouldn't be subjected to that. And the Australian Prime Minister took all of about 3 seconds, which is his normal, usual decision-making cycle, to say, no, you're not going to get special decisions made. Meanwhile, New South Wales has basically said we're going to be opening up. So Australia continues to be a fiasco, but the UK is in for a lot more of these issues, because that European, or the exit from Europe, was about as intellectual as watching a series of Barney. It was basically just done as an ad hoc decision of emotion and historical beliefs that they're gonna pay for it. Back to you, Bhargav.
That's true, Paul. I can't agree with you more. Before I go into an anti-colonial rant, I'll move on to Africa.
Ironically, back to Africa.
Yes. So in Nigeria, there seems to be continued trouble with the bandits as well as Islamist terrorists. In northwestern province of Sokoto, there was an attack on a military base where nearly 22 or 23 soldiers and policemen were killed. And this is a continued problem in West Africa, and there seems to be no solution to it from the last 10 to 15 years. Islamic State, as well as Al-Qaeda affiliates, have wreaked havoc across borders. It may be Nigeria, it could be Burkina Faso or Niger. Very recently, we did a detailed report on terrorism in West Africa. So we can certainly provide that to our clients again if this is of concern. However, there seems to be no end to such ravages by renegade groups, bandits, as well as Islamist terrorists. Paul, do you see any end to this anytime soon? This seems to be a reflection of incompetent authority at the national as well as regional level. There seems to be no leadership. Paul?
Sorry, mate, I was on mute. Look, there's no, I mean, it's not unique to there, is there? You know, insert many other countries in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in South America. I mean, things don't change when you've got toxic government that's out for its own. It's only the degree of hardship that creates for society. I mean, even in established countries like Australia, the crisis is exposing poor governance, poor leadership, poor management. I think leadership died with Winston Churchill. Now you have a whole heap of different governments across the world that are just trying to concoct sessions at a pulpit with the PR and utilize the media to present themselves as good managers. But I mean, you know, name me a great leader that inspires across the world at the moment. You know, perhaps on sports paddocks, but you can't find too many in the UN or the political auspices. So no, I can't see it changing. I can see it getting worse, mate. COVID's a factor to making it worse. Climate change is a significant factor. Food security, therefore, becomes a factor. Supply chains are going to put on stresses. And the selfish malingerers in charge are not going to be thinking about anything other than self-wealth. So no, can't see it changing, can see it deteriorating.
I must agree, Paul. There are very few exceptions. Unfortunately, they're reticent in nature in terms of their foreign policy. One example which comes to mind is Paul Kagame in Rwanda. However, his background is quite controversial, him being
yes,
a quasi-authoritarian within his own country. Though Rwandan military has played a very constructive role in some of the conflict zones, such as northern Mozambique, such leadership is lacking, especially in Africa at the regional level. In Europe, we can see Chancellor Merkel leading from the front for the European Union. Unfortunately, that is changing soon. But I must agree with you on the whole. Paul, moving out of Africa, any developments in Southeast Asia?
Oh, look, I mean, Myanmar's sadly seeing significant escalations. You know, there's been recent airstrikes in the Sagaing region, and that demonstrates a significant escalation in the conflict between the Tatmadaw and the armed resistance groups. You know, and now we're seeing multiple armed resistance groups that are active in the area, and there's been a lot of casualties in the last few days. Throw on top of that, you've got attacks against Mytel, which is a telecommunications company. That also indicates there's a likelihood of military-backed entities and assets being targeted. When I say military, I mean the current Myanmarese government, and so the resistance forces are, you know, they're working out what are the high-profile targets. What's also sad is we've seen the Indian, excusing pronunciation, but the Meitei rebels up on the border, they're continuing to cooperate with the Tatmadaw, which is the Myanmarese military. They've got mutual business interests with them, and they get access to resources, and obviously they're in commercial cahoots with the Tatmadaw, so that doesn't go well. In Indonesia, we've seen yesterday anti-corruption demonstrations. We've also seen, you know, ongoing demonstrations in Kendari City, which is in the southeast of Sulawesi, and that's marking an anniversary of a couple of students who were killed by the police force a couple of years ago in 2019. Then you've got all the issues going on in Papua, of course. You know, security forces, again, we're going to send extra people to Kiwi Rock District. Well, it's been 50 years, and every time there's an incident, you're going to send more people. But if you send corrupt, ill-meaning people to act in an autocratic manner that show no integrity, that steal resources, rape, commit human rights atrocities, and escalate violence, it's probably not going to solve it by we are sending more security forces. I guess on a positive note, Thailand's made an announcement yesterday so that they've actually spelled out a 3-phase plan to opening up the country. Phase 1's to just loosen up some of the curfews they have only by an hour. So instead of from 9 p.m. till 4 a.m., they've changed it till 10 till 4. And they basically said that people coming into the country are not going to be quarantined for as long if they're already fully vaccinated. So they're reducing for fully vaccinated quarantines are going from 14 down to 7 days. But they've also laid out phase 2 and phase 3. Phase 2 is 10 more areas, which are basically tourist destinations, including where I normally reside in Thailand, in Hua Hin, and its neighbouring city Charm, but also the other well-known tourist resorts such as Pattaya, Chiang Mai, and Ranong. Ranong is sort of a favourite area to go down and cross into Myanmar. It's probably about 4 hours south of Hua Hin, so about 6 hours south of Bangkok. They've also stated 20 other districts are going to open up on the 1st of December, and that includes a couple of the famous tourist destinations for very historical purposes, including Ayutthaya and Sukhothai, and also Chiang Rai and Trat. Trat is also Trat mainland, but also part of that district is the Elephant Islands, Ko Chang. So, they're really spelling out a plan now, and it's been very difficult to do because you've had conflicts between what the tourist agencies want, what the health agencies want, what the Prime Minister wants for economic purposes. And we're seeing the usual farcical situation in Thailand where the restaurant industry, a group of restaurants is trying to sue the Prime Minister for 50 million baht because of impacts of COVID decisions. So Asia's its normal pear-shaped self, Bhargav. But the reality, though, is in the case of Thailand, even though with ongoing demonstrations today by the pro-democracy Talufar group, we're seeing that Thailand's basically said, well, look, 13% of our economy's service sector. Service sector is comprised, a chunk of that's tourism or tourism related, and we need to crank up and get going. Obviously, they've delayed these opening ups because their vaccination program wasn't well run. They just didn't procure the right or enough vaccines, and then they directed provinces and districts within provinces to open up and gave them a rule that you'll have to have, made 70% of double vaccinations, but then didn't actually procure the vaccines to enable them to do that. I know our district's getting very close if it hasn't already hit 70%. So by the time it opens up on 1 November, it'll be well past 80%. But, Hua Hin and Cha Am, for instance, the government's actually stated in these 9 areas in phase 2, it will be within the designated areas. So, for example, our house is a couple of Ks outside of that designated area, or where we assume the designated area is. So they've said in designated areas, but they haven't actually defined those designated areas yet. They also haven't defined if they're going to need certificate of entries to be completed, or are they going to switch over to a digital system and showing your vaccinations on arrival. That's all up in the air. So it's kind of a plan, but some of the details lacking. So that's about it from Southeast Asia without going into the other 30-odd issues that we've reported on today, Bhargav.
Thank you, Paul. With that, can we call it a day unless Uday has any final word?
Not from me, Bhargav. Thanks.
Well, look, I'll just say, I've skipped North Asia. I've left out Australia, Pacific Islands, covered off on Southeast Asia. And thanks for doing South Asia, folks, in Europe, Middle East. Thanks, Bhargav. Thanks, Uday. Cheers.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Uday. See ya.
Thank you.